my cigarettes, loaded with regret, and I find myself a spot between space and time.
Audiophiles are crazy for the Koss Porta Pro and KPH-30i. Look at all the positive reviews everywhere. Forums, Amazon, YouTube, there's an overwhelming consensus that the Koss are good headphones. A subscriber sent me his KPH-30i to test and send back, and I also bought the Porta Pro. I've had both headphones for several months and have listened to them on my phone, DAPs, and desktop gear. I have not done an unboxing and typical review of either headphone, and frankly, I will not. YouTube is inundated with so many videos on these headphones regurgitating the same thing that it made no sense for me to do what everyone else has already covered ad infinitum. Instead, I intend to upload a video talking about my experience with the Koss headphones and why they are a tough sell, why I think they sound fine but fall short in some material elements. But this is not that video. I'll say this off the bat, both the KPH-30i and Porta Pro sound pleasing to me. They don't have the same sound signature and are different enough to say that Koss did make a new headphone when they released the 30i. Both headphones have a bass emphasis and treble roll-off. The bass in both is different. The 30i has more sub-bass rumble, the Porta Pro has more bass impact. Both headphones have recessed mids, although vocals on the Porta Pro do sound clearer. Both headphones have, to put it very simply, a natural sound signature. This is the type of sound reproduction people immediately recognize and bob their heads to. Neither headphone is accurate. They're both, well, kind of analog sounding. And that's not a slight, it's a badge of honor. For the last few months, I have looked for an alternative pair of headphones to the Koss. I think the Koss sound fine, as I said, but their build and comfort is annoying. I looked far and wide but couldn't find any comparable headphones. Until recently, when I came across the Philips Fidelio M1mk2. There were very few reviews online. These headphones have been discontinued, but you can still find them on Amazon and eBay between $50 and $75. It's a shame these headphones aren't made anymore, because they are a real contender to the Koss. The M1mk2, as you can guess, is the second version of the M1. In this review, I will be referring to the M1mk2 as simply the M1. The M1 is made of aluminum, leather, and memory foam. This is not the same build as the Philips SHB 9500. That headphone is lots of good plastic. The M1 is more like the L2, which should be considered the bigger brother. The M1 is an on-ear design headphone. The ear pads have a fabric mesh in the center surrounded by the leather. The pads are not swappable, although you can peel them off for modification. The headband doesn't have a lot of padding, but there's not much pressure on the top of my head, so the minimal padding is just fine. The M1 has a weird cable design. There's a 3-inch connected cable to the left ear cup. Philips includes in the box a cable extension. Both the attached and extension cable are made of the same fantastic material. It's fabric, bright orange, sturdy, faultless, and does not cause harmonics when rubbed against clothing. The extension cable has a microphone capsule with an answer button. There's no playback buttons on this. The M1 has impressive specs. It has a 40mm driver that is super sensitive. These drivers are 16 ohms with an SPL of 107 decibels. That's well into IEM territory. The drivers have a frequency response of 6 Hz to 28,000 Hz. The M1 sounds like the Koss headphones had a big brother who went to war, came back mature, and ready to beat the crap out of the little brothers if they misbehaved. In other words, although the Koss headphones sound good for general purpose, the M1 takes everything, and I mean everything, that the Koss can do and does it a little better. For my initial listening test, I plugged the M1, Porta Pro, and KPH-30i into my Astel & Kern Con Cube, FIO M3 Pro, and my Modi Liquid Spark setup. I played music through Amazon Music HD, and I tried to volume match. Let's start with the bass. The M1 has a deep bass that never bloats. It never gets harsh. It never distorts. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the rumble is immediately noticeable at the beginning of the song, but it doesn't overwhelm the percussion, synth, and violin. The organ's bassy character is there without distorting the rest of the mix. When the crescendo hits, the organ's rumble is clearly audible, but the rest of the instruments are still present. The organ doesn't drown them out. In Pure Water by Mustard and Migos, the bass sounds just like what I want a hip-hop song to have. It's impactful, has a bit of sub-bass rumble that does not bloat, and is reasonably fast. This isn't anywhere close to planar magnetic bass response, but it falls perfectly in line with well-tuned dynamic driver performance. The bass never overpowers the mids. The mids instead remain crystal clear. The vocals have a bit of sparkle without harshness, without grain. The vocals sound about one step ahead of the mix. When I switched to the Koss headphones to compare the bass, there was a noticeable difference. The first difference is in the power requirement. Both Koss headphones need to have more power to reach the same volume as on the M1. The Porta Pro's rendition of Mountains was leaner. The rumble was present and noticeable, but just barely. The bass doesn't linger very long. It's fast, and certainly faster than as I heard it on the M1. The Porta Pro had muddier presentation of the crescendo. The organ definitely overpowered the other instruments, and the rumble became bloated. It sounded as if the bass was the most prevalent frequency. On Pure Water, the Porta Pro had less sub-bass presence than the M1 did. In fact, there was a huge difference here. Whereas the M1 rendered the subwoofer sound, the Porta Pro rolled it off almost entirely. The bass was also less impactful than on the M1. The vocals were not nearly as clear as they were on the M1. The vocals were not overshadowed by the bass, but there was not much air in the mids. In other words, the vocals sounded more intimate, as if someone had draped a thin bedsheet over the speaker. I repeated the same bass test on the KPH-30i. The sub-bass was more prevalent here than on the Porta Pro. It was somewhat similar to the M1. However, going back and forth, it appeared that the M1 sub-bass presentation had slightly less reverberation and was a little quicker. The crescendo was markedly different on the 30i than on the other headphones. The sub-bass rumble was overpowering, drowning out the other instruments. I assure you, it was a fun sound, but rather bloated. I could hear the bass distorting just slightly with every emphasis of the organ. On Pure Water, the 30i again had a similar bass response to the M1, but with a slightly longer reverberation. The mids were very similar to the M1, but the M1 had a bit more clarity and air. I then switched to Want You Back by Haim. On the M1, the primary vocalist's voice was crystal clear, and her natural sibilance was recreated without harshness. The backup vocalists were easily heard with their separate tonalities. In fact, and this was most surprising, when all the instruments were playing, I could still clearly hear the separate tonalities of all three vocalists. There was a little bit of melding, but not that much. The vocals sounded about one step ahead of the mix. There was a little bit of melding between the bass and mids. The KPH-30i had a different tonality. The primary vocalist sounded a little veiled, and her natural sibilance was rolled off noticeably. I could hear the two backup vocalists with their individual tonalities. However, when the entire mix was playing, the two backup vocalists' voices melded, and it was difficult to tell them apart. The Porta Pro yet again had a slightly different rendition. There was a bit more treble emphasis on the Porta Pro than on the 30i. The Porta Pro did recreate the primary vocalist's natural sibilance. The two backup vocalists were easily heard initially, but when the entire mix played, their tonalities melded. However, despite the melding, they were still barely audible as separate vocalists. I listened to several other songs such as Natalie by Milk and Bone, Tomorrow by Daughter, and Superposition by Young the Giant. I went back and forth amongst the three headphones, played and replayed each song, and the results were consistent. The M1 had the clearest vocals every time, with better detail in the mids. There were nuanced breaths in the middle of lyrics that stood out more than they did on the Koss headphones. The KPH-30i bloated the bass more than the others. The Porta Pro's vocal rendition was very close to the M1, but still sounded just a little veiled. I could sum the mids frequency in this way. The M1 pushes the mids ahead just a bit, which helps bring out some details that the Koss headphones simply steamroll over. The differences are sometimes great and sometimes very slight, depending on the song. I then switched to Bim Bam Smash from the Bourne Supremacy soundtrack. This is an excellent orchestral combination that pushes bass impact and energy. The M1 had a fast bass response with this song. The bass was impactful but never bloated. The other instruments were clearly audible throughout the song. There was excellent instrument separation. I could hear the electric guitar in the left ear cup, the snare drums in the right. The timpani was strong yet well controlled. That particular frequency never distorted. On the KPH-30i, the timpani sounded a little distorted in comparison to the M1. The bass was still fairly fast, but the overall bass reverberation lasted just a tiny bit longer on the 30i. It was obvious that the drums were overpowering the other instruments. The electric guitar was far less clear on the 30i than on the M1. Volume adjustment didn't change this. The instruments overall tended to meld far more on the 30i. The Porta Pro had a fairly impactful bass, very similar to that of the M1. The electric guitar was slightly clearer on the Porta Pro than on the KPH-30i, but still not as clear as on the M1. The bass impact was more obvious than on the 30i. However, just as with the 30i, the instruments tended to meld together. I can encapsulate the differences by asking you to play the song between 2 minutes and 21 seconds and 3 minutes and 5 seconds. During this portion, instruments phase in and out between timpani, electric guitar, snare drum, and brass. The separation of instruments is noticeably better on the M1 than either Koss headphone. The individual timbre of the instruments is more easily audible on the M1. Soundstage among the three headphones is also different. The M1 has about average soundstage. The Koss headphones equally have slightly above average soundstage. When I put the Koss headphones on after the M1, I had a sense of more openness. This, however, lasted only a short time. As soon as I switched back to the M1 in the middle of a song, I noticed more detail and instrument separation. The slightly wider soundstage on the Koss headphones did not equate to a whole lot. The Koss headphones are fine for what they are, but they aren't perfect and have some serious drawbacks. The build of both Porta Pro and KPH-30i is laughably silly. The Porta Pro's terrible headband deserves ridicule. I had to scotch tape mine so that it wouldn't move. Whereas the 30i has a better headband, their ear cups do not swivel as the Porta Pros do. This means that although the Porta Pros have ear cups that will fit more naturally, the headband and clamping pressure is going to be uncomfortable and annoying. On the other hand, although the 30i has a headband that is more sturdy and provides some padding due to the rubber band substructure, the ear cups don't swivel, and that causes pressure points. Then there's the issue of the very thin attached cables. The cables transmit audible harmonics when rubbed against clothing. Yaxi makes ear pads for the Porta Pro. They cost about $12. They make the Porta Pro considerably more comfortable to wear. Without these ear pads, the Porta Pro's clamping force on the ears becomes unbearable for me. Technically, you can replace the KPH-30i's ear pads, but the ear pads are held in place by pressure. You would have to snap the ear pad and its housing off, and this housing holds the drivers in place. You have to be very careful when doing this, since the clips holding each housing in place are fragile. I did not attempt to change the ear pads on the 30i. This is a subscriber's unit, and I did not want to risk breaking the retaining clips. The M1 is not all roses either. Some will find it uncomfortable. It is heavier than either Koss headphone, and if you're opposed to on-ear headphones to begin with, the M1's greater weight won't win you over. There's no easy way to replace the M1's ear pads. There are workarounds, but that takes time. On the KPH-30i, you just have to be extra careful. On the M1, you have to plan it out like you're about to assault the Death Star. The M1's silly 3-inch attached cable is stupid. It is evident that Philips could have made the cable detachable from beginning to end. The 3-inch mechanism is more complicated. It requires more manufacturing. And then there's the warranty, or really lack thereof. The M1 has been out of production for years. You won't get replacement parts. Koss provides lifetime warranty, and you'll need it, because both headphones are on the flimsier side compared to the M1. The cables will be the first things to go on the Koss headphones. Then again, if you try to change the ear pads on the 30i and break the retaining clips, you're out of luck, because that is user error. The M1 really should be on my oldie and a goodie playlist. Every Philips headphone I've heard has its own character, both in build and sound. I have the X2, SHP 9500, L2, and now the M1. One thing I can say is that Philips made great headphones. There's something for most people. I think the M1 should get a lot more recognition. They provide better detail and clearer sound than the much-hyped Koss headphones. The M1 has better build by a long mile. The Koss Porta Pro, KPH-30i, and Philips M1 are good in their own rights. They all have something different to offer. They all have the same class of sound. That is, All three have elevated bass and rolled off treble. All three sound very natural to the ear. But the M1 seems to provide more detail to boot. If you can find the M1, I highly recommend it. It's one of those headphones that will disappear given time. And when you get enough experience as an audiophile, you eventually learn that chasing the newest or most hyped thing is a losing game. There will always be something newer next year. There is a joy in finding old, forgotten headphones like the M1. It helps you appreciate excellent equipment from the past. It helps put all the hype into perspective. And frankly, I'm really glad I found the M1.